Hey there, it's Jason Gorman from Codemanship with another video diary entry. Before we start, if you're enjoying these videos, please like and subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. Okay, so in my previous video diary, I talked about the pros and cons and some of the patterns that I've used in the past for testing web front ends or testing user interfaces more generally. And I showed a little demonstration using a very popular tool called Selenium WebDriver. And for driving a simple website that basically controls a shopping basket in a guitar shop, Guitar Shack. And you may recall, let's just run these Selenium tests here. So they're written in good old-fashioned JUnit using the Chrome driver. So this is going to spin up an instance of the Chrome web browser for every one of these tests and perform a bunch of actions and ask a bunch of questions about our shopping basket. This one should be working against a web-based, off it goes. Any minute now, it's going to find our homepage. We're just waiting for Microsoft Azure to spin up our web server while we're at it. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff going there, adding products to the shopping basket, checking that the total is calculated correctly, and so on and so forth. And this is all good fun, and we talked about some of the disadvantages of testing logic this way, particularly when it comes to performance, because you want your tests to run fast. But it naturally raises the question, because I'm a kind of test-driven kind of dude, can we actually do this the other way around? So I'm writing Selenium WebDriver tests against a website, a web application that already exists. It's already out there and deployed. But what if the web application doesn't exist? Now, one of the things that can go wrong in the design process, and I'm not just talking about websites here, web applications, we're also talking about smartphone apps and Windows apps and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that goes wrong very often is that a user experience designer or a web designer gets involved at the beginning of the process and essentially designs the front end, designs the user interface before the developers have even discussed the actual functionality. And this can lead to all sorts of problems, particularly when it comes to the developers understanding what these buttons are supposed to do under certain circumstances. But also it is when you design, for example, web pages, static HTML, it is a little bit like presenting someone with a bunch of movie sets and then saying, okay, now you make up the story. It's not really supposed to work like that. Really, the set design should be happening alongside all the other parts of the design process, and it's the same with UI design. So what we call the functional elements of a UI, in other words, what can the user see logically, and what can the user do, what actions can they perform, without thinking about whether it's a button click or a link or whatever, but functionally, what do they need on these web pages in order to be able to perform the actions that we're talking about, that we're agreeing on. And one way that we can drive this shared understanding is to actually do test-driven development at the front end. So to test drive essentially web pages that don't exist yet. And then we can figure out, based on those tests, what are the elements that need to be on those web pages in order for the user to be able to perform those actions, and in order for us to be able to answer the questions that we need to answer. Now, being a test-driven kind of a cat, I probably would go off and agree, let's talk about our shopping basket, go away and agree tests, little test scripts or little test cases with my customer. So this would be the start of the process. So at this point, no UI design has happened. I'm just going to emphasize that. At this point, no UI design has happened. So let's say we're in a room, we're with our customer now. It would be great to bring the user experience designer into that meeting as well. That's a very important person to have in there. And we agree a bunch of customer tests. So we're talking about empty shopping baskets, putting a single item in the basket, putting 2 items in the basket. And so we figure out what actions is the user performing in this particular little test script, and what questions will we need to ask to be sure that the action has worked correctly. So we go through our little test cases there. And what we could do is we could actually sit down with the UI designer, let's say the web designer, if it's a website, and say, okay, let's actually write a test that fails for this first particular scenario. And in writing that test, we're going to have to figure out, we have to agree, what web pages do we need and what needs to be on those web pages in order to be able to perform this test. And then we can build up a set of sort of very bare bones, literally just the functional elements that are required. So none of the visual design or the layout necessarily, although you might want to put in just enough layout and accompanying text to make it obvious what's going on, so you can then show it to the customer. But it's the equivalent of wireframes, but they're working wireframes in the sense they're real web pages. And the idea then is once we've got these bare bones web pages with no code behind them at all, just bare bones HTML basically. Once we've got that kind of framework figured out, the logic of it, then we can go away and build the code that makes the logic work behind the scenes, and the web designer can go away and actually create the fully functioning, featured, designed, beautiful web pages, making sure, of course, that they're still passing those tests at every step. So as we integrate, so our web designer is checking in changes to the UI, the visual elements, while we're checking in code that makes the UI do what it does. So eventually, hopefully, we meet in the middle. So I'm just going to do a quick demonstration of this, because you might be sitting there scratching your head going, well, what's he actually talking about here? So let's just take this first test as an example. So let's just going to the checkout before we've added any items to the basket and testing what the total of that basket is. What web pages and what elements on those web pages would we need in order for that to happen? Now, we found, because navigability is an important part of a web design, that rather than go directly to a checkout page, what we're going to do is we're actually always going to start each of these tests at the same point. We're always going to go to the root, the home page, and that will force us then to include navigation elements, links, for example, that can take us to where we need to be, to make sure that they are part of that design, that we've got all the pages and all the buttons and all the links that we need in our design. So the user isn't having to use the site by manually typing in URLs, the web equivalent of the command line. Okay, so what we're going to do is, here's our empty website here. We're going to, let's run it now. So we're going to run our little web server here. So it's an empty site, it doesn't do anything. And once this is up and running, it'll attempt to open a browser, and we should see, we're getting an error message because there is no home page. So we're good to go. And we're going to go into our Selenium test project. So the website, just to demonstrate different technologies working side by side, the website is ASP.NET Core, so it would be C#, but we're writing our tests just for Jolly in Java, so we're using JUnit. So let's start going forwards by saying, well, okay, let's begin by going to the home page. So localhost, I think it's 5,000, and so that should take us to the home page. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, let's get a handle on a link that takes us to the checkout. Okay, so we're going to fetch a web element. Oh, shouldn't be like that. And we'll call this the checkout link. And we'll find, so we'll look on this page for a link that contains the following text, partial link text. Checkout. Okay. So that's the action that the user is performing, essentially. Now, if I run this test now against the website that we've got, what's going to happen is it's not going to find that link, which means our test is going to fail. So in glorious test-driven development style, we're obeying the golden rule. We're not going to create any web elements unless we have a failing test that requires them. And we can see that it's failing there. Let me just scroll up, and messages aren't particularly helpful, but yeah, it can't find that element, basically. There is no checkout element with that link text. So let's go back to our web design. Let's stop the... Of course, we could speed this up by using raw HTML, but I'm just going with ASP.NET Core web pages for now. So they need to be recompiled. And let's add a page. Okay. Call that index, so that should become our home page. And what we're saying is, wherever we put it on this page, there needs to be a link. Let's do the minimum possible. Let's have a link. And that link is going to, for now it doesn't matter, but let's just localhost. Actually, we don't need to do that, do we? We can go relative. So let's just go to the basket, please. Okay, and our link text needs to contain the word checkout. Okay. So that's the minimum we need to do. Functionally, that's all we need. We need a home page, and it has to have a link with the text checkout. So let's run our web server again. This is obviously a slightly cumbersome process, but I'm sure it could be speeded up in different ways. Any minute now, we should get a web browser. There we go. And we now indeed have that checkout link. And if I click on it, of course, there is no such page. Just start shutting down a few of these. Okay, now that means when I run this test now, it's going to pass because that element does actually exist on the page. So this is not visual web design. This is not about usability per se, although usability issues will inevitably come up, which is why it's important that the user experience designer is part of this process. So this might be a pair programming or a mob programming exercise that we might do with the user experience designer in the room, so they can say, well, hang on a minute, we should have one of these, or we should do it this way. But a lot of the issues around usability will come up outside of the functional elements per se. We're just doing the absolute basics here. So our test is passing. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to click the link, and that should take us to a checkout page, or basket. Did we call it basket? Probably. But this page doesn't exist. And if we attempt to get the total, which is what we're interested in, so let's say we use a text box to display the total. So let's give a text box. We could use an ID here. So, oops. So we can use the ID total. So that's the total of items in our basket. And again, if we try to do this, there is no page with that element on it. So again, we're forced to make that happen. But let's just see the test fail first. Okay, so we got another failing test because there is no such element. So again, we go back to our web design and we say, okay, well, let's create this basket page. So again, all we're interested in is the functional elements of it. Doesn't matter what the title is, etc., etc. Those are issues for the user experience designer to figure out. How do these things need to be displayed? How do they need to be described, and so on and so forth. So that's where their real expertise is. But we need to agree on the functional elements. So inside our div, let's create, first of all, let's have some text. So we can probably put this there. So let's create the text something like total. So all we're doing here is saying, look, we need to know what this is. I need my pound sync symbol. You may have noticed I have a browser open. You should be closed, thank you, with symbols on it. So I'm just going to copy and paste the HTML symbol for the pound sign, the good old British pound. Worth slightly less today than it was 4 years ago. And then after this, we want some kind of input. Oops. So this is going to be our type equals text, and we're going to give it a value of 0. So we're not doing any calculations. We're not being fancy pants here. We're just saying that is what is supposed to be displayed here. And that's what we need on this page for it to work. You don't like that because... What don't you like about that? There's a paragraph, there's blocks. How about if I just do this instead? That might do it. Okay. Let's just going to stop and restart the server. Now, those folks among you who are complaining there's something wrong on this page, what's wrong? Oh, no. Okay, it's running. Theoretically, are you running? having a little think. Okay, and if we actually go to the checkout, we should see that total equals 0 like that. So it's purely functional at this point. We're not worried about the layout or anything like that. It just needs to be good enough for us and our customer and the user experience designers so that we all understand what it means. And at this point, in terms of test-driven development, that's what we're exploring. What does it mean when we add a product to a basket and so on and so forth? So we can go back to our Selenium project. So this element now exists. Okay, and not finding it. Unable to locate element. Total. Interesting. We went to the checkout, did we not? Partial link text checkout. Click the link. It wasn't bothered about that, but then it couldn't find the total element. No such element. Let me just double check on our web design here. So there should be a website here. Change the text checkout, definitely for sure. And we're getting the total. Let me just do the page source just to be sure. It's because this is why we do these things. So in order to make this more testable, we need to give our input a unique ID, which was actually in the test, Jason, so that we could easily get a handle on it in our Selenium tests. Right, okay. Let's stop and restart. Slightly laborious process, I'm sure you'll agree. Okay, now when I run this test, it should pass because it does find an element called total. So the idea is the test is telling us this is what you need on that web page, or these are the web pages that you need in order for this test to actually work, in order for the user to be able to perform the actions they should perform. Now there's one little piece of the jigsaw here. Now that we've got that, we can assign it to an actual number and then write an assertion at the end. Actually, we'll need to parse this because it's a string. And we'll need to find the value attribute. That's where the number is. So we get the value of the total. And then finally, we can assert that our total is equal to 0 with a margin of error of 0. So that's our complete test. Our test is passing, our assertion is passing. So the idea of sort of doing test-driven UI design is not, I should warn again, our goal here is not to end up with a whole bunch of system tests, although obviously we will, that we then rely on. You would still then go off and write unit tests for the internal logic and also for unit tests for the internal representation of the user experience. And that's where this technique can be quite powerful because we are explicitly defining what that user experience is at this high level, at this logical level. And it should match identically internally. So if you, for example, have view models, those view models should be a one-to-one match between the logic of the UI externally and internally. Now, if we were doing this whole thing in Java, we could probably actually, let me just show you, if you haven't seen this from the previous video, you'll notice in my video that we're not interacting in the tests with WebDriver at all, really. We've actually got this thing called a basket driver, and we're interacting with that. So there are add, checkout, and so on and so forth, and they're kind of a match for the logical actions that are being performed in our test, the logic of the user experience. So if we just take a look at that WebDriver, that basket driver there, you'll see that there's a bunch of stuff happening internally. So that's where all the actual interactions with the web elements are, and they're hidden. Now, if you were a clever kind of a person, you could maybe have something like a basket driver interface and then have different implementations of it. So one implementation interacts with the website, clicking buttons and so on and so forth. But the logic of those interactions is the same as the internal view logic, the logic of your view models. So you could also have a different version of the driver that interacts with the internal view model if you're doing it in the same programming languages. So you could essentially have them as unit tests of your user experience, but the same tests, just a different setup and a different way of driving the logic. You're driving it. It's the same logic, the same. We're telling the same story, but we're telling it at different levels of abstraction. So it is entirely possible, and I've worked on teams where we've done this very successfully, to get the user experience designer involved in this test-driven design process. Mob programming is especially good for this. So we're all on the same page. And it's also good to get dedicated testers involved in this as well, as part of this process of defining these tests and helping us to automate these front-end tests. So you can end up, if you're a smart kind of cookie, with multiple versions of the same tests that are about the user experience, but that can be retargeted, for example, not just retargeted at different kinds of UI or different kinds of web browser, but retargeted at different levels of abstraction. One, for example, that interacts with your internal view logic. If you're using view models in ASP.NET Core, for example, those are unit testable, hopefully. So you could basically have a different version of the thing that drives the app, that drives it at different levels of interaction, different levels of abstraction. But the very important thing to remember is we're all telling, at whichever level, we're all telling the same story. Okay, so there you go. That's a little sort of demonstration of how you can test drive the design of a UI. You can get UI becomes part of the test-driven design process. So if you're doing, for example, specification by example, or behavior-driven development, or whatever you want to call it, that's really when you want the UI designer to get involved. We tend to find it's a bit of an anti-pattern when they get involved up front. Before we've even any developers have even picked up any user stories or use cases, someone's already presented them with a fait accompli, which is, well, these are the wireframes, or this is the HTML, or whatever it is. We tend to find that that's a bit of an anti-pattern. And of course, you need to do just enough, one, for us all to walk away with an exact understanding of exactly what is supposed to happen and what elements are therefore required in the user experience, the physical UI. But also you need to do it well enough. It needs to be tidy and presentable enough so you can actually present this to customers and say, well, look, don't worry about how it looks too much. So if your UI designer is good, for example, with Bootstrap, making things look tidy and presentable and logical, then you would just do the bare minimum possible to make it look okay. And I would strongly recommend not going any further than that. So you do kind of want UI prototypes that look kind of like this, not pretty and certainly not finished. If you present end users or customers with applications, for example, websites that look finished, they will assume that you are already done or that you're very nearly done with it. Whereas this sort of approach, like rough prototypes or wireframes, tends to make it pretty clear we're nowhere near done yet. And of course, we're not actually writing the code to do any of these calculations yet. We're just embedding the data in the web pages, and you can mark up the HTML to make it very clear where the embedded data is. So in ASP.NET Core, for example, or Java server faces, you can adopt a convention that basically says code goes here, code will go here, code will go here. You can actually do it for real. You can have some hard-coded elements, some constants at the beginning of your page processing that are dynamically inserted into the page as you go down. So again, it's not doing anything. It's just hard-coded data, but you made it very clear to the designer. That's our piece. That's the bit we do. And the rest is, up to you, but it must continue to pass those tests. What we do with the tests afterwards, well, I mean, they are useful to leave around, but like I said in the last video, testing through the UI has all kinds of disadvantages. On a day-to-day basis, as a developer, I would want to be able to ask all of these questions, like what is the total of an empty basket, using unit tests. And I would like to be able to test most of the user experience through something like a view model, so the sort of MVVM kind of patterns that Microsoft recommend with ASP.NET Core, so that most of it is unit testable, is get-atable, basically, with unit tests. And then you might retain some of these system level tests, essentially as configuration tests or as smoke tests, so that you are just checking that the thing as a whole, end to end, does work on the deployment target platform. So the intention here is this is not about test automation, really. This is about us getting together and explicitly agreeing this is what the UI is, logically. This is the sort of the bare bones of it, so that then the designer can go away. And that's not, again, we're not presenting them with the fait accompli. They're with us creating this HTML, creating these pages, creating these elements, but they're doing it in such a way that it is the bare minimum, it's the bare bones. And then they can take it away and flesh that out and create a much more rounded and more marketable user experience. Okay, there you go. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe. Until the next video, take care.